Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It had been a long day, and the house felt colder than usual. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound filling the silence. I had just gotten home from work, tired but eager to relax. The apartment was empty, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. The air outside was damped from the rain earlier, and the scent of wet pavement seemed to cling to everything. I dropped my bag by the door, kicked off my shoes, and made my way to the living room, looking forward to a quiet evening. The lamp on the side table was flickering, its warm light sputtering as it flickered on and off, casting long shadows across the room. It was odd, it had never done that before, and I thought I must have forgotten to replace the bulb. I walked over to the lamp, twisting the knob to turn it off and on again, but the flickering persisted. I shrugged it off and sat down on the couch, trying to focus on the book I had been meaning to finish. But every time I looked up, the lamp flickered again, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift unnaturally. It was hard to ignore, that feeling of unease that began to crawl under my skin. There was something strange about the way the light and shadows moved, as if they had a life of their own. I sighed, trying to concentrate on my reading, but my eyes kept drifting back to the lamp. The flickering grew more intense, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer with each blink. And then, in the briefest of moments, as the light dimmed, I saw it, a face. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a split second, it was there, just a reflection in the glass of the lamp, but the face was unmistakable. It was pale, its features sharp and angular, with eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. I could see the faint outline of hair, dark and wet, hanging loosely over the face, but the expression, there was something wrong with it. The face looked almost surprised, as if it had just realized I was there, looking at it. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But when I looked again, the lamp was back to its usual flickering, and the reflection was gone. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked over to the lamp. It was just a regular light bulb, nothing strange about it. I twisted it off completely, but the flickering continued, the shadows still dancing across the room. I turned around, feeling a cold rush of air against my back, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The mirror on the wall, just beside the lamp. The reflection in it was off, strangely distorted. The room in the mirror didn't match the room around me. It was like looking into a different space entirely, a dim and empty version of my apartment. But in the reflection, there was something more. Someone standing there, just behind me. I spun around, my breath shallow. The room was empty, no one was there. But in the mirror, I could still see the figure. It was a faint outline at first, a shadowy shape in the dim light. But it was moving. Slowly, it seemed to be getting closer, its form becoming clearer with every step. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the glass of the mirror. The figure in the reflection mimicked my movement, its hand coming up toward the surface as if it was reaching for me. I backed away quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure in the mirror continued to move toward me, its face now clearer, though still strange and distorted, like a face that didn't quite belong in the reflection. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, its mouth stretching into a faint, unsettling smile. I turned away from the mirror, looking back toward the lamp. It flickered again, the shadows around me seeming to grow darker, more oppressive. I glanced back at the mirror. Now the reflection was different. The room was as it should have been, the reflection of my living room now, in perfect alignment with the real one. But there was no one in the mirror anymore. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. My mind must have been playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just exhausted, stressed from the long day. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and turned back toward the mirror, half expecting to see something different this time. But when I opened my eyes, I saw it again. The face. It wasn't in the lamp's reflection anymore, but now it was standing behind me. Its features sharper than before, its mouth twisted in an unnatural grin. It was there, in the reflection of the mirror, looking right at me. I felt a cold rush of fear grip me, and without thinking, I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the dimness, and the shadows shifted again, but now, the face in the mirror wasn't just looking at MIT, was moving. The figure stepped forward, reaching out of the mirror, its fingers stretching, inching toward me. My hand was shaking as I shined the flashlight at it, but the light didn't seem to touch it. The figure was still in the mirror, but it felt like it was standing right next to me. I spun around once more, but the room was empty, silent. The lamp flickered again, casting a brief shadow on the wall, but there was nothing behind me. No figure, no presence. I rushed to the door, my heart racing, the sensation of being watched growing stronger with every passing second. As I reached for the door handle, I glanced at the mirror one last time, and for a split second, I saw something. A reflection of myself. But my reflection wasn't moving the way I was. It was still standing there, frozen, with that same twisted smile stretched across its face. And then, in the reflection, I saw the face behind me once again. The figure wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was asterisk in the room with me. I didn't know why I agreed to meet her. It was one of those spontaneous decisions I'd make when I was feeling particularly bored, when the weight of the world seemed to press down just a little too hard. Her name was Clara, and we'd met randomly at a cafe a few days ago. A simple conversation over coffee turned into something more: shared interests, shared jokes, and a little spark of connection that I didn't think I'd find. That night, as we sat talking on the small park bench outside the cafe, she handed me a slip of paper. "I thought we could keep in touch," she said, her smile soft and knowing. "Maybe we could hang out again sometime." I took the paper, glancing down at the number she'd written neatly in blue ink. There was nothing unusual about it, just a string of digits like any other phone number. But as I slipped the piece of paper into my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't know why, but the way she had given it to me made it feel like there was something more behind it. The next day, when I got home, I took the number out and dialed it, half expecting it to go straight to voicemail. But it rang a few times before someone picked up. "Hello." Her voice sounded distant, almost like she was in a different room. I was taken aback for a moment. "Clara." "Yes, it's me," she said, though there was something strange in her tone, as if she had expected me to call. I'm glad you did. I was hoping you would. I hesitated, not sure how to respond. So, what's up? She chuckled softly, but it didn't sound quite right. I was thinking, why don't you come over? We could talk more about all the things we didn't get to share last time. I think it'll be fun. I'll text you the address. Before I could reply, the line went silent, and I heard a soft click, as if she had hung up. A little confused, I shrugged it off. Maybe she was just being friendly, casual, like most people do when they want to hang out. She had seemed kind and easy to talk to. I sat down and waited for the text, which arrived minutes later. The address was one I didn't recognize. It wasn't far, but it was located in a part of town I'd never been to before. It was on the outskirts, close to the older part of the city, near the train station. Still, I figured it was worth checking out. I had nothing else going on, and besides, I was curious about her. So I grabbed my jacket, shoved my phone in my pocket, and made my way to the address she'd sent. The streets were quieter than usual. The old buildings lining the narrow roads seemed darker, the windows reflecting the dim light of the street lamps, casting strange shadows on the cobblestones. It felt like I was walking into a different world, one that didn't quite match the bustling city I was used to. I reached the address, a small, nondescript building with a worn wooden door. It wasn't exactly the type of place you'd expect for a casual meet. The door had a brass knocker shaped like an old lion's head, and the windows were covered by heavy curtains. The place had an air of abandonment to it, like no one had bothered to care for it in years. I hesitated for a moment, but then I rang the doorbell. The sound echoed through the quiet street. For a moment, there was nothing, no movement from inside. But then, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Clara stood there, smiling warmly, as though this was all completely normal. "You made it," she said softly, her voice almost too inviting. "Come in." I stepped inside, unsure of what to expect. The interior was dimly lit, and the furniture was sparse-old chairs and a large wooden table in the center of the room. There was a faint smell in the air, like old books and dust. It was quiet, too quiet, but there was something oddly comfortable about the silence. I looked around for a moment, but Clara stepped ahead, leading me further into the room. "Just relax. I've been wanting to show you something," she said. There was an odd sense of urgency in her voice, but her expression was calm, serene even. She led me through a narrow hallway into another room, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt a sudden chill. The walls of the room were lined with old photographs, all in black and white. It looked like a museum, a collection of faded memories that seemed frozen in time. I noticed one photograph in particular. It was of a group of people standing in front of a building, but the faces were blurry, like they had been intentionally smudged. One face, though, was clear, Clara's. "Why do you have this?" I asked, pointing at the photograph. There was something off about it, something unsettling. Clara smiled, but her eyes didn't meet mine. "I'm glad you asked." Her voice sounded distant, like she was speaking from far away. Suddenly, the walls seemed to close in on me. The photographs that once seemed innocuous now seemed too close, too familiar. They were all of people I didn't recognize, standing in places I had never seen. And yet, somehow, they felt connected to me. Each frame felt like it was part of a larger puzzle, one that I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. I turned to leave, but as I stepped back into the hallway, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening thud. The room was suddenly dark, the air thick and suffocating. I reached for my phone, but it was gone. I turned to Clara, who was standing there in the doorway, watching me. Her smile was gone. There was nothing left in her face but an unreadable emptiness. "Clara," I said, my voice shaking. "What is this? Where are we?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the window, staring out into the dark. And when she turned back to me, her expression was blank. "You've always been here," she said softly, her voice distant, as if she wasn't speaking to me at all. "You just never saw it before." The room around me seemed to shift, the edges of reality warping like a bad dream. The photographs on the walls began to move, the people in them blinking, shifting. I backed away from her, but the walls felt like they were closing in, the space around me becoming smaller, tighter, until all I could hear was the steady beating of my heart. And then, without warning, I found myself standing in the street outside the building again. The door behind me was closed, the windows dark. I looked at my phone, but the number Clara had given me, her number was gone. There was no trace of her, no record of our conversation. And as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been led into a place I would never recognize, a place I wasn't meant to leave. The alley was narrow, tucked away behind the row of old buildings that lined the street. I had walked through it countless times before, never thinking twice about it. It was the fastest way to get from one side of the city block to the other. A shortcut that took me past the dumpsters, the half-dead plants in cracked pots, and the crumbling brick walls that always seemed to have graffiti on them. It wasn't the nicest part of the city, but it was familiar. That evening, I had just finished a long day and was eager to get home, so I decided to take the alley. The air was thick with the promise of rain, and the street lamps overhead flickered, casting long shadows on the wet pavement. I was half distracted by the thoughts of my day when I stepped into the alley, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. It wasn't until I reached the end that I noticed something unusual. At first, I thought it was just the dim light playing tricks on my eyes, but as I reached the end of the alley, where I normally would have emerged onto the main road, I stopped. The wall in front of me where the alley usually ended wasn't the same. The brick was smooth, undisturbed, as if there had never been a passage through. It was just a solid wall now, a wall that hadn't been there before. I took a step back, blinking, trying to make sense of it. The alley was too familiar, too much a part of my routine. I had walked this way every day without fail. But now, instead of the street at the end, there was only this blank, impenetrable wall. I turned around to look behind me, but the alley stretched out the same way it always had, narrow, dimly lit, lined with the same graffiti, the same clutter. The only difference was the wall at the end. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't possible. I had walked down this alley for years, and I knew the layout of this part of the city like the back of my hand. There had never been a wall here before. I took a few hesitant steps forward and reached out to touch the wall. It was cold to the touch, the surface smooth and unyielding. I pushed against it, as though somehow I could force it to give way. But it didn't. I turned back toward the alley's entrance. I had to be mistaken. Maybe I had turned down the wrong alley or wandered off track. But no, this was the alley I always took, the one that led me to the street I knew. I started walking back toward the entrance, my steps quickening. I needed to get out of here. But when I reached the spot where the alley opened onto the street, I stopped dead in my tracks. The street that was supposed to be there, the one I'd just walked toward, was gone. Instead, I was standing in a completely different place. The road in front of me wasn't the one I recognized. There were no cars, no familiar buildings, no stores I could make out. It was a desolate, empty street, the buildings appearing ancient, their windows cracked and boarded up. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting pale, erratic light that barely illuminated the cracked pavement. The air was thick with fog, making it hard to see beyond a few yards. I spun around, hoping to see something familiar, but the alley was gone. There was no sign of the entrance, no trace of the alley I had just walked through. All that remained was this strange, deserted street. I was frozen, standing there at the edge of the unfamiliar road, my breath coming in short gasps. What was happening? I had just been in my usual neighborhood, just a moment ago. How could everything change like this? I turned to look at the buildings again. The ones here were old, like they belonged to a time that didn't match the city I knew. Their faded, weathered exteriors were completely out of place. The windows were dark, and the doors were locked, almost as if they hadn't been used in years. I took a few tentative steps forward, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the more I walked, the more I realized how wrong everything felt. The ground beneath me seemed to change, the cracks in the pavement growing wider, more uneven. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow, but it wasn't enough to shake the feeling of being out of time. I looked around desperately, hoping for some sign of the street I was supposed to be on, but there was nothing. No street signs, no familiar landmarks. Just an endless stretch of pavement and broken buildings. The air was heavy, damp, and it carried a strange scent, like something old and forgotten. I turned again, looking over my shoulder at the spot where the alley should have been, but it was gone. The alley had vanished as though it had never been there at all. I stood in the middle of the street, completely alone, with no way to go back. I didn't know what to do. I felt a growing panic, like I was trapped in a place that shouldn't exist, a place that didn't belong. The streets stretched on forever, each corner leading to more unfamiliar terrain, each step pulling me further away from the world I knew. The fog seemed to close in on me, swallowing up everything in its path. The world around me was shifting in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if I had passed through some threshold, some barrier that had cut me off from everything familiar. The city I thought I knew, the street I had walked down for years, had all disappeared, and all I had left was this strange, empty place. I stood there, unable to move, the weight of confusion and fear pressing down on me. The alley had led me somewhere else, and I didn't know how to find my way back. It was a rainy evening, the kind of night where the world feels muffled, as if everything is softened by the constant patter of raindrops against the pavement. I had missed my usual bus, and the next one wouldn't arrive for another 10 minutes. So, I found myself standing at the bus stop, waiting, my jacket hood pulled tight against the dampness in the air. The street was quiet, almost eerily so. The only sound was the rain, lightly tapping against the metal and glass shelter of the bus stop. I wasn't the only one there, of course. There was usually a handful of people waiting at this time, but tonight there was no one else. The shelter was empty except for me, and it felt strangely isolating. I glanced around the empty street, the distant glow of streetlights casting a muted yellow hue over the wet pavement. Everything felt still, too still. It was as though the entire world had paused, held its breath in that odd moment before the rain began to fall in earnest. I checked my watch. 7:14 p.m. Still a few minutes to go. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, trying to get comfortable, but the unease had settled in. There was something about the silence that seemed to stretch out longer than it should have. I glanced over at the empty bus schedule poster. There was no one else here. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, barely perceptible at first, like a faint rustle of fabric, or the soft scrape of shoes against the wet ground. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I looked around quickly. The street was empty, and the shelter was still just as it had been empty. But the sound, it lingered, growing clearer, more defined. It was breathing. I turned my head slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The sound was coming from somewhere in the shelter, though there was no one else there. I stood perfectly still, listening. In the quiet of the rain, it seemed impossibly loud, slow, deep, deliberate. As if someone was standing right beside me, just out of sight, breathing deliberately to make sure I heard them. My heart began to race. The sound was closer now, right behind me, just over my shoulder. But when I looked, there was no one. The shelter was still empty. The small bench beside me was untouched, the space around me vacant. I took a cautious step back, my eyes scanning the shelter again. Was I imagining it? I had been waiting for a while, and maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, making me hear things. But no, the breathing was real. I could hear it clearly now, almost as if the person was standing directly behind me, just inches away. My pulse quickened. The air felt colder all of a sudden, and the hair on my arms stood up as though something unseen was moving closer. I glanced over my shoulder again, but there was still no one there. The shelter was as empty as it had been when I arrived. Was someone hiding in the shelter? I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and took another step backward. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the breathing quiet slow seemed to fill the space around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was right there, so close that I could almost feel the weight of their presence. But every time I turned around, I saw nothing. The silence in the street seemed even louder now, the rain falling in heavy sheets, but the sound of the breathing remained steady, deliberate, like a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone, that there was something here, just beyond my reach. I couldn't bring myself to leave the shelter. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, the dread crawling up my spine, making it impossible to turn away. And then, as if on cue, the soft hiss of the rain softened for a moment, just enough for me to hear it clearly. Inhale, exhale. The breathing was right behind me now, as close as it could possibly get. I could feel it cold and steady, like a whisper in the still air. It was too real, too present. I couldn't deny it. I spun around, my eyes wide with panic. And there, in the corner of the shelter, just beside the bench, was the shadow of a person. But when I looked closely, I realized it wasn't really a person. It was just a shape, an indistinct figure, darker than the shadows around it. A shape that wasn't quite solid, but it was there, in the corner of the shelter, standing still. The breathing stopped, abruptly. I backed away from the shape, my heart hammering in my chest, my hands trembling. The rain, which had been falling steadily, seemed to pause for just a heartbeat. And the world outside the shelter seemed even more silent, more oppressive. My throat felt tight, as though I couldn't breathe. For a moment, I thought I saw the figure shift, but then it was gone, vanishing into the dark corner, as though it had never been there at all. I rushed out of the shelter, my feet stumbling over the wet pavement, the breath in my chest coming in sharp, uneven gasps. I didn't stop running until I reached the next block, where the lights were brighter and the street seemed more alive with people. And when I glanced back, I saw the bus stop empty, completely empty. No one waiting, no one standing, not a single trace of movement. The only sound was the steady beat of my own heart, still pounding in my ears. The rain had stopped, but the feeling, the breath that had followed me, stayed with me, even now. It was still there, waiting in the quiet corners of my mind. It was a normal morning, one of those quiet, peaceful ones where everything seemed to fall into place without much thought. The kind of morning where the air feels fresh, the streets are calm, and the world is just waking up. I had spent the early part of the day at the coffee shop down the street, savoring a hot cup of coffee and lost in the pages of a book. As I left, I decided to take the long way home, walking through the neighborhood streets, enjoying the gentle morning light filtering through the trees. I was strolling along, lost in thought, when I saw her. She was standing at the corner near the bus stop, her back to me. She had the same short, messy hair, the same brown jacket that she always warmed my best friend Anna. I didn't think twice. I called out her name, half expecting her to turn around, as she always did when I showed up unexpectedly. But she didn't. She stood there, completely still, her posture a little too rigid, a little too perfect. For a moment, I thought it was odd, but I brushed it off as just another one of those moments when you catch someone in a trance, lost in their own thoughts. I walked up to her, still calling her name, but she didn't react. There was a small part of me that felt uneasy now, a slight flutter of confusion in my chest. I stopped a few feet behind her, hesitant. She didn't seem to hear me, and it felt like she was intentionally ignoring me. The way she stood there, unmoving, struck me as odd. But I couldn't figure out why. "Anna," I said again, a little more softly this time. Finally, she turned, her face breaking into that familiar, warm smile. It was the kind of smile that always made me feel like everything was going to be okay. But as she looked at me, her eyes, there was something strange about them. The smile was too wide, too perfect, almost as if it didn't belong to her. She blinked slowly, but there was something off about her movements, too deliberate, too slow. "Eh?" she said, her voice calm, though distant. "I didn't hear you. Sorry about that." She tilted her head to the side, almost curiously. "I thought you didn't hear me at first," I said, the oddness of the moment settling deeper in my chest. She smiled again, that same smile, and then said, "Well, I'm glad you found me." Her tone was soft, pleasant even, but it felt hollow, like the words were rehearsed. I watched her for a moment, unsure of what to say. There was an uncomfortable pause before she spoke again. "I should probably be going soon," she said, her gaze drifting away, as if there was something distant she was focused on. "The bus is leaving soon." I nodded, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked. The question felt strange on my tongue, but it slipped out before I could stop myself. "You're acting a little off today." Anna blinked, then laughed softly, though there was something empty about it. "I'm fine, don't worry. Just a little tired, that's all." She waved, her hand moving slowly through the air, but something about it felt unnatural. The motion was too smooth, too rehearsed, as if it had been practiced. I returned the wave, but the gesture felt hollow in my own hand, like I wasn't entirely in the moment with her. And then, she said it. "Goodbye," she said, with that strange smile still on her face. "See you soon." I watched as she walked toward the bus stop, her back to me now, but before she got too far, she turned back and waved again, that same slow, deliberate wave. The bus stop wasn't far, but I didn't follow her. Instead, I stood there, rooted to the spot, a feeling growing stronger in my chest. As she reached the curb, she turned again, the same wave, the same smile. And then, just like that, she was gone. I watched her walk toward the bus stop, her figure blending with the crowd. But as I turned to head in the opposite direction, I froze. I turned back. Anna was standing right next to me. I had no idea how she had gotten there, no idea when she had moved. One second, she was at the bus stop, waving, and the next, she was standing in front of me, as if she had never left at all. Her eyes met mine, and she smiled, that same perfect smile. But now it looked like something more, something that was no longer Anna. The smile was wide, far too wide, and her eyes were glassy, empty. She tilted her head again, slowly. "Do you want to come with me?" she asked, her voice too calm, too soft, as if we were having a normal conversation. But there was something else there, something that didn't belong. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't understand how she had crossed the street so quickly, or how she had gotten so close without me seeing her. The air around me felt colder now, like I was standing in the middle of something that wasn't real. "Anna," I whispered, my voice cracking. "What's going on?" She tilted her head again, the smile never leaving her face. "You should come with me," she said again, and this time, it sounded almost too sweet, too enticing. But there was something dark beneath it, something that made my skin crawl. I stepped back again, my legs trembling, as I realized what was happening. This wasn't Anna. It couldn't be. The person in front of me looked like her, but everything about her was wrong. The way she moved, the way she smiled, the way she spoke. I turned to run, but when I looked back, she was still standing there. She was still waving. Only now, she was waving from across the street. But this time, I wasn't sure if she was ever standing next to me at all. And I realized, with a chill creeping down my spine, that she was always just there, waiting, always one step ahead, even when I was sure she was behind. I never saw her again. It was a cool, quiet evening, the kind of night where the world feels like it's gently winding down. I had just finished a long day and was walking home, enjoying the solitude of the dimly lit streets. The neighborhood I lived in was quiet, peaceful, with rows of houses that looked almost identical small, cozy homes with well-kept lawns and the occasional light flickering in the windows. As I walked, I passed by an old house on the corner. It wasn't anything special, just another house in the row, but it had a certain charm to it. The windows had a warm, inviting glow, the curtains gently drawn, and for a moment, I found myself glancing at the window closest to the street. And that was when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just a normal scene, people sitting in the living room, maybe enjoying a quiet evening. There was a woman sitting on the couch, her posture relaxed, a book in her hands. Beside her, a man was reclining in an armchair, staring off into the distance. A child, maybe 5 or 6, was playing on the floor with a toy car, her legs tucked beneath her. But then something caught my attention, something that made my breath catch in my throat. They weren't moving, none of them. Not even the slightest shift, the smallest gesture. The woman with the book wasn't turning pages. The man wasn't shifting in his chair. The child, with the toy car in her hands, wasn't making any movements at all. They were frozen. The scene looked perfectly normal. At first glance, everything was in place. The furniture, the little details in the room, the way the light was reflecting off the glass, but there was no movement. No life. It was as if time had stopped for them, as if they were caught in a moment, forever suspended in the stillness of their poses. I stood there for a long moment, watching them through the window, my heart thudding in my chest. I blinked, thinking it was some trick of the light, a reflection perhaps. But when I looked again, nothing had changed. The figures inside the house remained frozen, perfectly still, as if they were caught in time, locked away in their own quiet world, completely unaware of the passage of time outside. I felt a strange sensation creeping up my spine, a cold, crawling feeling that I couldn't shake. I took a step back, my breath coming faster, my eyes still locked on the window. This wasn't normal. People don't freeze like that. Not without some reason, not without something happening. I glanced down the street, half expecting to see someone walking by. Someone who might notice the same thing I had, but the street was empty. The only sounds were the distant hum of the city, the rustling of the leaves in the trees. The world around me felt almost too quiet, too still. I couldn't pull my gaze away from the window. Something in the stillness of it, the way the people didn't move at all, was pulling me in. Almost like I was drawn into the scene. I had to know what was going on. I stepped forward, closer to the window, my face almost touching the cold glass. I knocked lightly on the window, hoping to stir some reaction, hoping that maybe they were just in a trance or deep in thought. But there was no response. No flicker of awareness. The woman didn't look up from her book. The man didn't turn his head, and the child didn't even glance in my direction. I knocked again, louder this time, and the sound echoed through the quiet street, but still no one moved. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I had to know what was happening. This wasn't right. But as I leaned closer to the window, something shifted in the corner of my Aja shadow, moving across the glass. I jerked back, startled, but when I looked again, there was nothing. No sign of movement, no change in the scene. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what to do. The air around me seemed heavier now, thicker, like something was waiting just beyond my sight. The light from inside the house flickered briefly, then stabilized again. And then just when I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, a small sound broke the silence. A soft thud. I glanced back at the window, and that's when I saw it. A figure, just behind the window, in the far corner of the room. It was hard to make out at first, hidden behind a sheer curtain, but then I saw it clearly. A figure standing motionless, like the others, but this one was different. It wasn't sitting, like the others, it was standing, just barely visible, its face pressed to the glass, looking out at me. My heart stopped. The figure was staring at me. It had no expression, no visible features, just a pale, shadowed face. But its eyes were locked onto mine, unblinking, unmoving. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged in my chest, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, behind the glass, watching me with an intensity that felt like it was burrowing into my mind. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, but when I finally tore my eyes away, the other figures, those sitting on the couch, in the chair, on the floor, were no longer frozen. They had shifted, just the slightest bit, as if the stillness had broken for a fraction of a second. But it wasn't the movement that scared me. It was the fact that, in that moment, the woman who had been holding the book was no longer looking at the book. She was looking at me. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached my apartment. My mind was racing, my heart pounding, and all I could think of was the image of the figure staring out from the window. The way it had watched me, the way it had felt like it had been waiting for me to see it. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the image in my mind, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I kept wondering, who were they? Why weren't they moving? The next morning, I decided I had to go back to that house. I had to know if it was all just a dream or if something was truly wrong. But when I reached the street, I stopped short. The house was gone. There was no sign of it. Just an empty lot where it had once stood, the foundation crumbling, the grass overgrown. The sidewalk was cracked, and the streetlights flickered faintly in the distance. I stood there, staring at the empty space, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw something in the corner of my Aja shadow, moving where the window used to be. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. Nothing but the empty lot. It was a calm, almost unnerving kind of evening. the kind that settles around you like a thick blanket, muffling all the usual noise. I had just finished dinner and was cleaning up in the kitchen. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house the only sounds breaking the silence. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the room dimly lit by the low glow of the streetlight outside. I stood by the sink, washing a few dishes, when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, tired from a long day, maybe. But as I glanced up, the shadows in the room seemed off. They didn't behave the way they were supposed to. It was subtle at first. The corner of the kitchen, where the shadows usually pooled, seemed darker than normal, but not in the way it should have been. The light outside filtered in through the window, casting its faint glow on the walls, but the shadows didn't stretch in the usual way. They were shifting. I blinked and stepped closer, my heart starting to thud a little faster. The shadows didn't just fall across the floor, they moved. They twisted and elongated in ways that didn't match the light, as if they were bending and stretching independently of the objects casting them. I looked over at the table near the window, where the chair was, but when I glanced at the shadow it cast, it seemed to grow longer, as if someone was sitting there, though there was no one there. I took a hesitant step forward. The shadow on the floor stretched again, like fingers reaching out across the room. But it was impossible. There was no reason for it to move like that. The light was steady. The world outside was still. I was the only one in the room. I stood frozen, staring at the shadows. They twisted further, growing and stretching in slow, deliberate movements. The shadow by the table morphed, the shape of the chair distorting as though it were being drawn by an invisible force. But the strange thing was, it wasn't just the shadow of the chair, it was like something else was forming in the corner, something I couldn't fully make out. I looked around the room quickly, hoping to find something that could explain it. But the furniture was where it had always been. The light remained steady, and nothing moved. I was alone. The house was still. The shadows, though, continued to shift. The light from the street outside flickered for a moment, and in that brief instant, the shadows pulsed, stretching and retracting as though they were alive, reacting to something unseen. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I needed to look away, I needed to move, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the dark shape forming in the corner, the way it was growing larger, almost leaning toward me, though the space was empty. I stepped backward, my breath shallow now. The shadows didn't stop. They continued to ripple, as if they were waiting for something. For me. I turned quickly, rushing out of the kitchen and into the living room. I needed a moment to breathe. But as I moved into the other room, I glanced toward the window. The shadows from outside those from the trees seemed to stretch unnaturally across the yard, their dark limbs twitching as if they were aware of my every movement. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, its hands moving steadily. The room, for the briefest of moments, felt like it had become a foreign place. Everything was too still, too quiet, and the shadows outside continued their slow, deliberate dance. I looked back at the kitchen. The doorframe between the rooms was dark, but I could see a shape in the corner, flickering. A shadow, but it wasn't my own. The feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. I turned toward the door to the outside, but the sudden thunk of the wind against the windows made me jump. I was half tempted to run outside, to escape, but something told me to stay. I took a deep breath and walked back toward the kitchen, my mind racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. I entered the kitchen and, for a moment, everything was normal again. The shadows had settled, returning to their usual places. The chair by the window looked as it always did, with its simple outline against the wall. I exhaled, relieved, but then I saw it. The shadow of the chair had shifted again, but this time it wasn't stretching across the floor. It was moving. It was as though the shadow was no longer bound to the chair at all. It was alive, creeping slowly toward me, inch by inch, following my every step. I backed away, my heart racing, as the shadow crept closer. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but the house felt suffocating, the air thick and heavy. The shape in the corner had grown more distinct now, and there was no denying it. Something was there. It was as if the shadows had decided to move independently, to break free of the walls and corners that contained them. I ran out of the kitchen, heading toward the front door. But just as I reached it, I froze. There, in the hallway just outside the kitchen, stood a shadow. But this shadow wasn't cast by any object. It was a person, tall and wide, with a dark, indistinct outline that seemed to flicker and pulse with the dim light. It was not my shadow. It wasn't anyone I recognized. And it wasn't me. I didn't dare to move. The shadow stood there, waiting, watching. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back, my hand shaking as it hovered over the doorknob. I wanted to leave, to run, but every instinct screamed at me to stay still. The figure didn't move. The shadows, however, continued to pulse in the dark, rippling in ways that made no sense. I glanced back at the door lock. The windows sealed no escape. The shadows were all around me, no longer confined to their corners, and they were moving, waiting, stretching in ways that shouldn't be possible. I reached for the light switch and flipped it, hoping the brightness would banish the dark. But the shadows only grew longer, their edges more defined, as though they were feeding on the light, growing stronger in its presence. There was no one around, except the shadows. I had been at the bar for what felt like hours, nursing my drink, lost in the usual hum of the evening. It was a quiet night, the kind where the conversations blend into background noise, and the clinking of glasses is the loudest thing in the room. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the polished wood of the bar, and the soft jazz playing in the background seemed to slow down time itself. The kind of night where you can just sit there and feel the weight of the world lift off your shoulders, even if only for a little while. I don't know exactly when she walked in, but I noticed her immediately. She was nothing extraordinary, nothing that would make her stand out in a crowd, and yet something about her presence seemed to shift the atmosphere in the room. She was dressed simply, in a dark coat and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She didn't make a scene, didn't command attention. She just walked in like she belonged there, like she had been part of this place for years. She approached the bar and sat down a few stools down from me. I couldn't help but notice the way she seemed to blend into the space. like she had always been there, even though I had never seen her before. Her eyes were tired, but there was something behind them, something that caught my attention, something I couldn't quite place. I glanced at her briefly, then turned back to my drink, but I could feel her presence still lingering in the corner of my mind. There was something familiar about her, like I had seen her before, though I couldn't figure out where. A few minutes later, she called the bartender over and ordered a drink. Her voice soft, almost like she didn't want to be noticed. I couldn't make out what she said, but I caught a glimpse of her face as she turned slightly. That was when it hit me, the familiar feeling. I had seen her in a dream, in that fleeting way you sometimes recognize a face you can't place. The memory was vague, but it was there, buried deep in the back of my mind. I was still pondering it when I noticed she had finished her drink and gotten up to leave. She wasn't in a hurry, no rush at all. She seemed to just be taking her time, like she was stepping into a place that was meant for her. She moved gracefully, without a glance at anyone else in the bar, as though she was floating on her own path. And then, as she reached the door, she turned around and looked directly at me. For a moment, our eyes met long enough for me to feel like there was some unspoken connection between us, like she had been waiting for me to notice her. But then she turned and walked out the door, the soft jingle of the bell above the door echoing as it closed behind her. I don't know what made me do it, but I stood up. Something inside me urged me to follow her, as if I needed to see where she was going, needed to know more. I wasn't sure why, didn't even know her, and yet there was a pull, an invisible thread that seemed to tether me to her. I walked to the door, the soft glow of the bar's lights spilling out into the street as I pushed it open. The night air was cooler than I expected, and I stepped out onto the sidewalk, my eyes scanning the empty street. She wasn't there. I blinked, my mind racing. She couldn't have vanished that quickly. I had seen her walk out, I had seen her leave, but now there was no sign of her. The street was empty. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of the leaves in the wind. I walked a few steps forward, searching up and down the street. No sign of her anywhere. Not around the corner, not down the alley. The street lamps flickered faintly in the distance, casting a soft light on the empty road. My heart started to pound a little faster. Had I imagined it? Was I just seeing things? I couldn't understand why she wasn't there. I turned back toward the bar, thinking maybe I had missed her, that maybe she had just slipped past me when I wasn't looking. But when I stepped back inside, the bar was completely empty. The bartender was gone. The stools were all vacant. The warm, familiar glow of the lights was still the same, but the place felt different, like it had been abandoned. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I walked to the bar and looked around, my mind racing. I glanced over at the door, expecting her to walk back in, but there was no one. The silence in the room felt unnatural now, heavy and oppressive. The air was thick with something unspoken, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I left the bar, stepping back out into the night, my heart still racing, my mind reeling. I walked down the street, retracing my steps, hoping, somehow, that I would see her again, that the world would somehow make sense again. But as I reached the intersection and looked back down the street, I saw nothing. It was like she had never been there at all. The bar was still empty. The street was still empty. The night was as quiet as ever. I couldn't help but wonder, had I imagined her? Was it all just some strange, fleeting encounter in my head? Or had she walked into the bar only to leave a memory behind, a moment that was never meant to be understood? I turned to walk home, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, but the unease lingered, twisting in the pit of my stomach. And as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I didn't think much of it at first. It was one of those moments when you find something in the most unexpected of places, and your mind immediately tells you, oh, I must have put that there without realizing it. But as I stared at the photograph in my hands, a strange unease settled in. I had been going through my wallet, organizing it like I usually do old receipts. A few crumpled bills, a couple of business cards, and that's when I came across it, a photo. It wasn't a picture I recognized at all. The edges were slightly bent, the colors muted as if it had been there for a while, tucked away in the small compartment of my wallet that I didn't check often. I pulled it out, turning it over in my fingers, hoping to find some sort of clue. The photograph was of me, or at least, it looked like me. I was sitting at a table, a coffee cup in front of me, my hands resting on the table in a relaxed position, but there was something odd about it. I didn't remember the setting. I didn't recognize the room behind me, the walls adorned with abstract paintings I had never seen before, or the heavy curtains drawn close by the window. The lighting was dim, giving everything an almost nostalgic, dreamlike quality. But the thing that unsettled me the most, I didn't remember taking this picture. I don't have a habit of posing for photos. I'm not the type to take spontaneous pictures of myself, especially not at a cafe or some random spot I couldn't place. I always thought I was the kind of person who would remember something like that. But as I stared at the image, I realized I had no recollection of ever being in that room, let alone sitting at that table. There was no timestamp on the photo, no date scribbled on the back, no indication of when it was taken. My heart started to race a little as I examined the image further. The more I looked at it, the more details seemed to come into focus. There was a book on the table beside Methan with a red cover, the title just out of view. I tried to make out the text, but the angle of the photo made it impossible to read. The coffee cup in front of me seemed familiar, but I couldn't place where I had seen one like it. I turned the photo over in my hands again, desperate for an explanation, something that would make sense of this odd, forgotten moment. There was nothing. Not a word, not a note. The photo had been tucked into my wallet, hidden in the small compartment where I kept old pictures, things I rarely ever looked at. It felt wrong, like I was holding onto a piece of someone else's life. I couldn't remember ever taking it, and yet, there I was, smiling faintly at the camera, completely unaware of the questions that would start swirling in my mind. I tried to recall the events of the last few weeks, wondering if I had gone to a cafe recently, if I had somehow forgotten this moment. But nothing came to me. I had no memory of it. no recollection of sitting down to a cup of coffee in a room that didn't look familiar. I flipped the photo over again, hoping against reason that there would be some clue I had missed, a name, a date, a hint about who had taken it. But there was nothing. I put the photo back into my wallet, trying to shake off the discomfort that was building inside me. I didn't want to dwell on it. Maybe it was just an old photo I had forgotten about. Maybe it was even from a time I couldn't remember clearly. I closed the wallet, trying to push the strange feeling out of my mind, but it lingered, a weight pressing down on my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the photograph, about how it didn't fit into my life. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image again, me, sitting at that table, in that room that felt so foreign, yet so real. And then, something even stranger happened. The next day, I opened my wallet again, intending to take out some cash, but when I looked inside, the photograph wasn't there. It wasn't in the same compartment where I had placed it the night before. I checked the other compartments, the small spaces where receipts and notes usually piled up, but it was nowhere to be found. My pulse quickened, a cold sensation crawling up my spine. I started to panic. Had I misplaced it? But how could I have lost something I had only just looked at the night before? I searched my wallet, my pockets, even the table where I had set it down, but there was no sign of the photograph. I could feel my mind racing, questions piling up faster than I could process them. Had it ever been there at all? Or had it been some strange, half-remembered dream? I didn't mention it to anyone. I didn't want to seem like I was losing my mind. But the feeling didn't go away. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of a stranger I had become to myself in that moment. How had I not remembered something so ordinary, something as simple as a photograph? Weeks went by, and I tried to forget about it. I tried to move on, to dismiss the unease that had settled in my chest. But every so often, I would find myself glancing into my wallet, expecting to find that photo again, to understand why it had disappeared. And then, one morning, as I was rifling through some old receipts, I found something. A picture. It wasn't the same one, but it was eerily similar. The setting was different, but the same faint smile was on my face. The same coffee cup was in front of me. The same red book lay on the table. But I had never seen this photo before either. And this time, there was no mistaking it. The photo wasn't lost. It had never disappeared at all. It was waiting for me to find it. And it looked like it had been there for far longer than I realized. It was just another walk home, the kind I'd taken hundreds of times before. The evening air was cool and crisp, and the streets were quiet as I made my way down the familiar path. The city had already begun to wind down for the night, with only a few cars passing by and the distant murmur of people talking on their balconies. I didn't have anything on my mind, just the usual hum of my own thoughts as I walked along the cracked sidewalk, my shoes tapping softly against the pavement. I passed the same landmarks I always did: an old bookstore with faded yellow curtains, a small cafe with lights spilling out onto the sidewalk, and the tiny park that always seemed to be empty at this hour. Everything felt normal, everything felt safe. But something, a small, strange detail, caught my attention as I approached the intersection ahead. I had crossed this intersection countless times before, but tonight something was different. The street signs had changed. It wasn't anything drastic, just a subtle shift. I stopped at the corner, looking up at the signs that hung above the intersection. The one pointing toward the left, where I always turned to head home, now read North Avenue. The one pointing to the right, usually Parkside Road, now said Elm Street. The sign on the opposite corner, which had always said Broadway, now read Old Mill Road. It wasn't the names that threw me off, though. It was the fact that I knew those signs had never said that before. I had walked down this street every day for months, and I was certain of the names of these streets, the way they were marked on the signs. They had always pointed the way I expected them to. But now, everything had shifted, as if the very street itself had subtly rearranged itself without me noticing. I took a step back, squinting up at the signs, trying to make sense of it. Maybe the city had decided to rename a few streets or update the signs, but I couldn't recall hearing about any changes. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the street signs had always been this way and I had just never paid attention. Maybe the fog of my own mind had just made them blur together. But no, something felt off. The feeling gnawed at me, tugging at the back of my mind like an unanswered question. I turned back to face the way I'd come, looking down the street. The buildings on either side were the same, their faces illuminated by the dim streetlights, but everything felt out of place. The sidewalk beneath my feet seemed slightly uneven, like I was walking on a different version of the street I thought I knew. I glanced up again at the signs, but this time, the names had changed once more. North Avenue was gone, replaced by something else I couldn't quite read. The sign for Elm Street had shifted into a name I didn't recognize, and Old Mill Road had become something completely unfamiliar. My stomach tightened. I took a few steps forward, now more aware of how strange everything felt. The air seemed thicker now, heavier, like the weight of the moment had settled over me, pressing against my chest. I stood there, staring at the street signs that kept changing, as if they were mocking me, or maybe trying to tell me something I couldn't quite grasp. I turned toward the next corner, hoping for some clarity, but when I looked up, the signs had changed once again. They didn't just look different, they felt different, as if they belonged to a place that didn't quite fit into my reality. But the most unsettling part was that despite the changes, the signs were still pointing the same way. The directions were still the same, the streets still led to the same destinations, but everything about them had become wrong. I reached out to touch the nearest sign, the metal cold beneath my fingers, but the moment I made contact, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, just slightly, as if the street itself was adjusting its position. I yanked my hand back, taking a few steps away from the intersection, my breath quickening, but the signs kept changing. And still, they pointed the same direction. I felt trapped, like I was stuck in a loop, walking through a version of my own neighborhood that didn't quite make sense. I looked around, hoping to see something familiar, but everything seemed a little off. The buildings, the streetlights, the trees lining the sidewalk, they were all the same, and yet somehow, not. I glanced down at the crosswalk in front of me. The light had just turned green, and yet no cars or pedestrians seemed to be crossing. The street was empty, but the odd stillness hung heavy in the air. I started to move forward, my steps cautious, but every time I glanced up at the street signs, they seemed to change again. I was about to take another step when I saw something out of the corner of my eye, someone standing at the far end of the street, just beyond the intersection. They were too far to make out clearly, but I could see the outline of a person standing there, unmoving. For a moment, I thought it might be a friend, someone I knew, but as I looked closer, I realized something was wrong. Their body was too still, too rigid, like a statue waiting for the world to catch up. My pulse quickened. I couldn't see their face, but I felt their eyes on me, the sensation prickling along the back of my neck. I wanted to call out to them, to ask if they saw the same thing I did, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. The moment was too strange, too unsettling. I turned back to face the signs again, and when I looked up, they had changed once more. They were no longer the street names I had seen before, they were completely blank now. Just empty metal poles standing silent in the night. The person at the end of the street had disappeared. The quiet, empty street felt like it was swallowing me whole. I took a few more steps back, my mind racing. The street signs were still pointing the same way, but they no longer belonged to the street I knew. And as I turned around to walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer walking down the same street I had just hours ago. The signs had changed, but they were still pointing the same way, and I didn't know where that way led anymore. It was a quiet evening, one of those nights when the world feels still, when even the city's usual hum seems to fade into the background. I had just finished a late shift at work, the kind that leaves you drained but oddly reflective. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the promise of rain, but it hadn't quite arrived yet. I walked home, not in any particular rush, just taking my time and letting the rhythm of my steps soothe my mind. As I approached the intersection, I noticed her. She was standing at the corner, waiting for the light to change. She wasn't anyone I recognized, just a woman in her late 20s or early 30s, dressed in a dark coat, her hair tucked under a scarf. She stood perfectly still, staring ahead, her hands wrapped tightly around the straps of her bag. The light from the street lamps flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the sidewalk, and the glow from the traffic lights painted her face in sharp, cold colors. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance, nothing to make her stand out. And yet, there was something about the way she stood there that caught my attention. It wasn't that she seemed lost or out of place. It was more that she seemed waiting for something, or someone. I don't know why, but I slowed down as I approached the intersection, my footsteps quiet against the pavement. The light was red, and she hadn't moved. There were no cars coming either way, but she didn't seem to notice. She just stood there, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the crosswalk, her expression unreadable. I watched her for a moment longer than I probably should have, but I couldn't help it. There was something unsettling about the stillness in her posture, something almost unnatural. She looked like she was waiting for something or someone who wasn't there. The crosswalk sign flickered on, signaling that it was safe to cross. But instead of walking across, she remained exactly where she was, unmoving. I glanced around. There was no one else at the intersection, No one standing next to her. No one waiting with her. The street was empty, the sidewalks silent except for the distant murmur of the city. The light changed again, from red to green, but she still didn't move. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why wasn't she crossing? Why wasn't she moving with the flow of the city? Everyone else would have gone by now. I took another step, my curiosity getting the better of me. Maybe I was just being paranoid, reading too much into her stillness. But there was a quiet tension in the air, an unspoken weight that seemed to hang between us. I was almost halfway across the street when I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from behind me. But when I turned around, expecting to see someone walking up to the intersection, there was no one. Just the empty street. The air felt thick now, like the world had grown just a little too heavy to breathe. I turned back to her, my steps faltering. She hadn't moved an inch. She was still standing there, perfectly still, waiting for something, or someone. The light turned red again, and I made my way across the street, the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to see her finally walking across, but she was still there, frozen in place. I continued walking, trying to ignore the feeling gnawing at me. Maybe she was waiting for a friend, or perhaps she was lost in thought, unaware of the time passing. I told myself that I was being ridiculous, that it was just an ordinary night. But as I walked further down the street, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. She was still there. The light had changed again, but she hadn't moved. She hadn't moved at all. That's when I realized the truth. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She wasn't waiting for anything. She was waiting for me. I don't know why the thought hit me so sharply, but it did. A cold realization, as though I had been walking toward something I hadn't understood until now. Something was wrong. Something had shifted, and I had only just begun to understand it. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about why she hadn't crossed the street, why she hadn't moved even when the light changed. And when I turned the corner to head down the next block, I glanced back once more, half expecting her to be there, standing at the intersection, waiting. But she was gone. There was no sign of her at all. The street was empty, the intersection completely deserted. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where she had been. The stillness in the air had returned, but now it felt different, as though something had been taken away. Something that had been there just a moment before, but was now gone. I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That I had crossed some invisible line, stepped into a place where the world no longer followed the rules I thought I knew. She had been waiting, but she hadn't been waiting for anyone else. She had been waiting for me. It started as a simple walk. I'd had a long day, meetings, deadlines, the usual grind, and I decided to take the scenic route home. The streets weren't crowded, and the air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't quite fallen yet. I always enjoyed walking this route, down the quieter side streets where the noise of the city seemed to fade away, leaving only the gentle hum of the world in the background. The building stood there, as it always had, right at the corner of the block. It was an old structure, weathered and worn by time, with bricks that had begun to fade and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. It wasn't a particularly remarkable building, just a small apartment complex tucked between two larger, more modern buildings. It had been there for as long as I could remember, its faded facade part of the familiar landscape I passed by every day. I walked past it on my way down the street, glancing at the building as I always did. The windows were dark, but the door was open, as if someone had just left. It struck me for a moment, but I shook it off. It wasn't unusual for people to come and go. The world was always shifting, and this building, with its worn edges and forgotten corners, had its place in the rhythm of the city. But then, something strange happened. I turned the corner, heading toward my destination. And when I came back down the same street not 10 minutes later, the building was different. I couldn't place it at first, but something had changed. The windows were now lit, casting a warm, inviting glow on the sidewalk. There were lights flickering inside, and a few potted plants sat neatly by the entrance. The door was closed, and the faded bricks looked a little cleaner, more polished, as though someone had just renovated the entire front. I paused for a moment, feeling a small prickling sensation at the back of my neck. It was the same building, but it didn't feel the same. There was a subtle shift in the air around it, a slight tension I couldn't quite explain. Had I missed something when I passed by earlier? Maybe someone had been cleaning or working on it without me noticing. I shook my head and continued on my way, trying to brush it off. It was probably nothing. Maybe I'd just been distracted earlier. But as I walked on, the unease lingered. The longer I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. How could the building change so quickly? It was almost as if I had passed through a different reality, a version of the street that I hadn't seen before. The next day, I took the same walk home, my curiosity nagging at me. When I reached the corner, I looked for the building again. It was just as it had always been, dark windows, faded bricks, the door ajar as if it hadn't been closed in ages. No lights, no potted plants. No change. I frowned, staring at it for a long time. Maybe I had imagined it the day before. Maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. I walked past it again, as I had done countless times before, but this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I felt like I was walking through a dream, as if reality itself had shifted just a little, and I wasn't sure if I was still in the same place. I decided to take the same route home that evening, just to see if anything was different again. The moment I reached the corner, I could feel my breath catch. There it was, again, the building. But this time, it wasn't the same building as it had been the day before. It was somehow older. The bricks were cracked, the windows boarded up, and the door was now completely shut, as if it had been abandoned for years. A layer of dust had settled over everything, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. I stood there, frozen. This couldn't be happening. I was sure that just yesterday, I had seen the building in its pristine, almost renovated state. But now it had returned to its dilapidated form. I reached out, my fingers grazing the cold surface of the brick, trying to make sense of it. But there was no explanation. I stepped back, my heart pounding. Had I walked into some sort of parallel world? Or had time warped itself in such a way that the same place existed in different forms, overlapping in ways I couldn't comprehend? The sound of footsteps behind me startled me, and I turned, half expecting to see someone walking past, but there was no one there. The street was empty as it had been all day. I turned back to the building one last time, the shadows of the evening stretching across it like an omen. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just walking through the city. I felt like I was walking through something much older, something that had been here long before I ever arrived. The building, with its layers of time, was no longer just a structure. It had become a part of something else, something intangible, something I couldn't reach. I quickly walked away, my pace quickening. The street felt longer now, the shadows deeper, the world around me slowly shifting, just out of reach. And no matter how many times I turned back to look at it, the building was always different, always changing. One moment, it was new. The next, it was old. It was as though it had never stopped existing in multiple versions of itself, and I was trapped in between them, unable to escape. And as I turned the corner and made my way home, I realized with a sinking feeling that the building was still watching me, even if I couldn't see it. It had become a part of my journey, a ghost of a place that would always change, no matter how many times I walked by.